David Halberstam was killed on Monday at 10:30 near Menlo Park, California, which is some distance from your school over in Berkeley in the East Bay. But I read somewhere that you had dinner with him Saturday night after he addressed the students. Would you tell us about why he was there and what you remember from your dinner?
Well, we had invited him out to participate in a day-long event on history and journalism, the way in which journalists use history. So he gave a talk that evening, and he and I did a conversation on stage just talking about a variety of things. And then afterwards, several of us went out to him with him to Chez Panisse and had dinner, and it was quite a wonderful evening because at the table were Sandy Tolan, who's an NPR correspondent who's covered the Middle East, Mark Danner, who's covered Iraq a lot, and of course I was there, and I met David in Vietnam, covered Vietnam, and also been to Iraq. And so the conversation really did settle in around the way in which these two wars did exemplify something about America, and the way in which in each case we had stumbled into what is inevitably now called a quagmire, even though the sands of Iraq are hardly the quagmire of Vietnam. But that seems to be kind of a leitmotif now in American involvement in the world, that word that David made so much a part of our vocabulary by the making of the quagmire, his book on Vietnam.
He was in a car driven by a grad student at Berkeley, a fellow by the name of Kevin Jones. I checked this morning, and they said it might be as much as 10 days before they can assign any kind of blame. There were 3 cars involved in the accident. Tell us the story about how Kevin Jones got to drive him on that Monday. He was on his way to see Y.A. Tittle, the famous quarterback, because he's doing a book on, I believe, a 1958 football season. Can you give us the background on how Kevin Jones was chosen to drive the car?
Well, David indeed had just finished the galleys of his last book, The Coldest Winter on the Korean War, last week or 2 weeks ago now. And he'd started his next book. And he was off to do an interview. And in his rather gracious manner, he had offered to have a student drive him around, and he'd said that he'd be very glad to, sort of hold forth, and we'd like to get to know younger journalists. And so we put an email out and saying he'd wanted to hire someone to do this, and young Kevin Jones said he would like to, and thus was fated to be in the car with David the last day.
Have you had a chance to talk to Mr. Jones? I
have.
And does he have any idea who's going to be charged in this thing?
It's impossible to know. None of the police reports, none of these things are in yet. I mean, the thing that apart from that is just this is an enormous tragedy for a young man to bear in his life, and I think it's something that just has him really in a state. It's extremely difficult and incredibly sad, and has, in fact, the whole school here at the University of California at Berkeley just kind of bewildered. We're having a large meeting, an all-school meeting at noon today to just talk about David and talk about how one confronts these kinds of things. After all, such events are not unknown in the lives of journalists who do cover all sorts of conflicts and wars.